first speaker is Andrew Garrett, Chair of Linguistics at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's Professor of Linguistics, and the Nadine M. Tang and Bruce L. Smith Professor of Cross-Cultural Social Sciences. He's an Indo-Europeanist specializing particularly in Hittite and ancient Anatolian languages, and in the past decade has begun serious research on the native languages of California, especially Yurok. More recently, he's been working on refining methodology of evolutionary biology for working out linguistic phylogenies, and that's what brings him here. So please, let's welcome him.
So as Brian says, I'm going to talk a bit about Indo-European chronology and phylogeny and the relationship between some traditional methods of doing figuring out the history of a language family and some newer methods of figuring out the history of a language family. Next slide gives a brief roadmap. So I'm going to have 4 parts in this presentation. First, I'll talk generally about language diversity and diversification and the discovery of language relatedness. Then I'll talk a bit about Indo-European phylogenetics, and I'll dwell on the main theme of the work that I and my students have been doing in this area, namely exploiting what we know about ancestry relationships between current languages and their ancestors to infer things about prehistory. And we'll wind up with some results and some conclusions. The development of comparative linguistics and historical linguistics is a byproduct in the late 18th and early 19th centuries of European colonial adventurism. In particular, there were 3 sites around the world where this was especially important. One of these sites was India, where the European mercantile incursions and then later the military conquest led Europeans to encounter Sanskrit and figure out the relationships between Sanskrit and languages of India and Iran and languages of Europe. The second site was in the Pacific, where colonial and scientific explorations exposed Europeans to Austronesian languages and the relationships among Austronesian languages. And the third site was America, where the invasion by French and Spanish and English people of the Americas led also to the encounter with a vast number of very different languages. So this encounter through invasion, this encounter with language diversity in the Americas is amply illustrated here. For example, Jefferson, in his vocabulary of a dialect of Unquachog, which is an Algonquian language spoken on Long Island, Jefferson clearly, in his description of his own fieldwork, indicates his interest. So he writes in this manuscript, the language they speak is a dialect differing a little from the Southampton dialect and also differing from the Montauk dialect. These 3 tribes can barely understand each other. This actually seems a bit unlikely, but the point is that his interest was in understanding the relationships between the languages that he was encountering. He then, earlier than that document, but in writing up his account of the relationship of Indian people in North America, he said, quote, "A knowledge of the languages of North America would be the most certain evidence of their derivation which could be produced. In fact, it is the best proof of the affinity of nations which ever can be referred to." And I've underlined the next sentence here because it highlights his concern already at this time, his concern with chronology and being able to figure out the chronology of undocumented earlier languages. How many ages have elapsed since the English, the Dutch, the Germans, the Swiss, the Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes have separated from their common stock? How many more must elapse before proofs of their common origin will disappear? I will use now and then at the end the term the Jefferson Desideratum, which is also a Robert Ludlum novel, to refer to his edict from the same source. Were vocabularies formed of all the languages spoken in North and South America, it would furnish opportunities to construct the best evidence of the derivation of this part of the human race. And so this is a mission that a lot of linguists since his time have taken seriously, that if we can figure out enough descriptive information about many, many languages, we may actually be able to infer things about their history. Jefferson himself assembled comparative vocabularies, as you can see here. So on the left there are numbers, and on the right there are birds. The languages are written down here, and then he has assembled all of this information in columns. And this is still the way a lot of linguists work. If you look at any kind of data source of this kind, whether it's like this or typed or in some digital database, you can pick out relationships and easily identify at least some languages that are connected with some other languages and form some kind of preliminary hypothesis about relationships, about phylogeny. But we would like to know when these groups that we identify emerged. So when people came to North America, when Europeans came to North America, it was obvious that there were a very large number of languages, and in particular a very large number of language families. These maps show in different colors the language families of North America. Also all the languages are shown, but you can see all the pink and all the blue. These are all different language families, and there are many of them. And the map on the right shows information that obviously would not have been available to Jefferson, but he was aware generally that the West Coast was a locus of language diversity. California has 100 indigenous languages. So there's some contrast that people were well aware of between the diversity of languages in the New World and the relative non-diversity of language families in Europe, where most of the languages are light green, that is Indo-European. Jefferson's comment about this discrepancy is quoted here, and his picture is on top of his actual picture. Arranging American languages under the radical ones to which they may be palpably traced, and doing so the same in Asia, he says you will find about 20 language families in America for one in Asia. And then he says, the underlined bit, a separation into dialects may be the work of a few ages, but for two dialects to recede from one another till they have lost all vestiges of their common origin must require an immense course of time, perhaps not less than many people give to the age of the earth. I think that his view of the age of the earth was different from mine. So thousands of years, and this is still the question for many linguists, how, if you have identified a set of languages that you think are related, how old are they, and when were they last a single language? So this problem can be addressed for Indo-European, can be asked for Indo-European. This is a map showing the distribution of Indo-European languages in approximately 400 BCE, 2400 BP. You can see that already at this time, the Indo-European language family had spread over a tremendous area from Ireland to India. And these languages were already quite different at the earliest moments when they are attested. Now, as Brian mentioned, there are two. Brian, you should sit down there so you can. Oh, you can. Can you see this? You should sit down there so you can see the slides. Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. It just seems unfair. Oh, here. As Brian mentioned, there are two prevalent models for the interpretation of the relationship of the Indo-European languages and their initial diversification. There's the traditional step model that many linguists have favored, which suggests that the point of origin was north of the Black Sea and north of the Caspian Sea around 6500 BP. There's the Anatolian model, which was devised by Colin Renfrew in the 1980s and defended in a series of subsequent publications, according to which Indo-European dispersed with the diffusion of agriculture starting around 9500 BP. So there's a big chronological difference between the two models. The question then for an Indo-European phylogeny like this one, where Proto-Indo-European is the ancestral language, is how can we figure out, given what we know about the actual documentation of these languages down at the bottom of the tree that actually have times, how can we figure out when this language was spoken? If we can figure out when the ancestral language was spoken, then we can decide between the two models. So there are a lot of kinds of argument that people use to infer ancestral chronologies. This slide shows a summary of the kinds of arguments that people have used. All of them, I would say, are controversial. So one class of arguments is from correlations with archaeological and genetic facts. And the problems with those correlations are that, obviously, cultural features can be transmitted, so visible archaeologically, and biological features can be transmitted, so visible genetically, without the transmission of language. The two things are not necessarily, do not necessarily go in tandem. So the inferences are indirect. And genetic data has not been, until recently, we'll hear later, until recently genetic data has not been as interesting, and archaeological data is always a bit controversial. There are arguments from linguistic geography, so arguments like Indo-European is typologically like other language family X, which is located in such and such a place, and therefore Indo-European should be near it. These are also arguments that can be disputed and often are disputed. The most famous arguments, I think, are the arguments from reconstructed vocabulary, and these arguments are really controversial for reasons that you can ask me about if you want. These are arguments that say, we reconstruct the following word for the ancestral language, so the word for a wheel, for example, that's one of the most famous ones. If the ancestral language had a word for a wheel, well, then they must have had wheels. We can figure out when wheels were invented. Wheels were invented sometime after agriculture was invented, and therefore if they had wheels, they must not have been the first agriculturalists. Right. So then there is dispute about whether that reconstruction of the word for wheel is accurate. And those are sort of complicated individual qualitative arguments that are sometimes hard for outsiders to get traction with. The last class of arguments is the one that I'll talk about in my remaining 9 minutes and 41 seconds. These are arguments about the differentiation of the Indo-European languages. Traditionally, linguists look at the languages and they say, oh, those languages don't look that different, so they must not be that old. The differentiation must be relatively recent. These languages look like English and German, so they must be 2,000 years differentiated or something. This is not quantified and it's kind of hard to defend. Lately, as Brian mentioned, linguists and others have taken over methods from biological systematics to address this. And that's what I want to show you something about. So this kind of argumentation is based on traits that often come out of vocabulary. These languages are not Indo-European languages. They are Polynesian languages, and they illustrate vocabulary traits. The words in A are all cognates, that's the technical term, across these Polynesian languages. All the languages have the same word. Probably the ancestor word was the same or very similar. In B, Hawaiian has a different word from the other three languages, Maori, Samoan, and Tongan, and you can code that up in some data set by saying Hawaiian has character state number 1, and the other languages have character state number 2, and somebody changed. So that's an informative data set, the data set in number B, and if you have lots and lots and lots of those, then you can do something with it. The ingredients of a phylogenetic analysis are listed on the right, typically. You have a set of linguistic traits involving hundreds of facts about the language, usually from vocabulary. You have some model of the evolution of traits, which you assume. You have some model of rates of change, and this is really crucial. If you want to figure out when the ancestral language was, then you need to impose some assumptions about rates of change. And then you have some hard constraints, like I know that Latin was spoken in the following year, or I know that ancient Greek is documented in the following year, or whatever. And then nowadays, you can use a computer program that will evaluate millions of possibilities, millions of possible language trees, and it will evaluate them against certain kinds of optimization criteria, and it will tell you roughly what are the likeliest, what trees produce the likeliest result. So this work was introduced in linguistics in 2000 in a paper on Austronesian. So this is a family tree that was produced by methods similar to this, a bit older, but similar to this, based on Austronesian lexical data. And what's kind of awesome about this result, and was instantly impressive to many people, is that it replicates very closely the results of traditional linguistic analysis that did not involve massive analysis of large lexical data sets. So they're clearly onto something. For Indo-European, you may possibly have encountered, because it got a lot of publicity a few years ago, a publication by some of the same authors and other collaborators out of New Zealand, in which they argued that the ancestral data of Indo-European, but based on these same kind of methodologies, was, if you can kind of compare this vertical line with this, the ancestral date of Indo-European was on the order of 8,000 years BP. That is significantly earlier than the STEP model. This was big news. It was published in Science. It was picked up everywhere. This is a kind of easier to read summary of the result of that paper, which is B, and some related work by the same authors and their collaborators, kind of consistently showing, using these methods, consistently showing dates which are shown in these vertical lines, and these are the medians of the highest probability dates, consistently showing a chronology that is consistent with the Anatolian chronology, that is the first agriculturalists' chronology, and not with the steppe chronology, that's the wheel, the horse and the wheel chronology out of the steppe. So this was a problem for a lot of linguists who were inclined, based on these qualitative arguments, inclined to favor the steppe model. And a lot of linguists said, oh, science bad, or I can't understand this math, that's too hard, I'm gonna go home. So what we did in our work first was to replicate this result of theirs using a similar data set and similar methodologies, just so we're all on the same page. And this graph on the right shows our replication of the graph on the left. You can see it's organized differently, and there are language names here. You can see if you look at the bottom here where there are dates, that the reconstructed ancestral date is nearly 8,000 BP, which is approximately the same as this reconstructed ancestral date, and the intermediate dates are roughly similar too. So the methods that they're using are indeed producing the results that they produce. They're awesome scientists, great. But something is fishy. And so it turns out that what's fishy is in the ancestry relationships that you can observe in the analyses of this work. So this is a kind of blown up section of our replication. And what it illustrates is the relationship between Old Irish and Modern Irish and Scots Gaelic and Latin and the Romance languages. And you can see that although it is conventional to say that Latin is the ancestor of the Romance languages and Old Irish is the ancestor of Modern Irish, in this inferred tree produced by phylogenetic methods, Old Irish is actually an aunt or uncle of Modern Irish, and Latin is an aunt or uncle of these languages. And it's actually not a very close aunt or uncle. These vertical lines are 1,000 years, so this represents roughly 2,000 years of linguistic evolution if you count both segments between Old Irish and its unattested sibling that's reconstructed as the ancestor of the modern languages. And similarly for Latin, there's this divergence plus that, so there's quite a substantial difference posited between the actual documented language, Old Irish and Latin, and the posited ancestor. We estimated the extent to which these languages would have diverged according to this analysis. The actual divergence here that's estimated for Old Irish would have been 17% between the actual Old Irish documented language and the one that is reconstructed by these methods, and for Latin it's 10%. That's a very substantial divergence in basic vocabulary. By way of comparison, the divergence between Portuguese and Spanish or between French and Italian in basic vocabulary is 11%. So this is to say that the difference between Latin and the putative ancestor of the Romance languages is on the order of the difference between French and Italian, which is simply false based on everything that we now know about, for example, Latin. We know a great deal about colloquial Latin. Here's a Latin birthday invitation. This illustrates colloquial Latin. We know a great deal about colloquial Latin, and the consensus of scholars in the field is that Latin did not contain within itself diversity on the order of Portuguese and Spanish or French and Italian. So there's something wrong in the results, and we argued that the reason why the results are wrong is basically that innovations that occur in parallel between, for instance, Latin and French and Old Irish and Modern Irish, parallel innovations that happen separately on the tree are imputed by the tools that are being used, the phylogenetic tools, are imputed to the ancestor of French and Modern Irish, which is something way up here. If you impute those innovations to the ancestor, then that creates this jogging effect. And that means that the dots, each of which represent a separate innovation, the dots are more widely separated. And that means if you think of the whole tree as an elastic structure, that means the whole tree gets pulled up earlier. So the effect of falsely imputing parallel innovations to the ancestor language, the effect of this is to push the ancestral date earlier. So there's a bunch of technical argumentation involving semantic and morphological drift to illustrate why this happens. Maybe I'll skip over it. I don't have to, but I think I will. But the basic technical problem is what's shown on the bottom of this slide. the trait models that are used in this kind of analysis do not account for parallel independent development satisfactorily. So what we did as an alternative is simply to hard-code these ancestral relationships so that ancient Greek was hard-coded as the ancestor of modern Greek, and so on. What that means is that we have inferred from the actual documented relationships what the rates of change are, and then we use that to infer the rates of change over the entire tree. And this results in not overstretching prehistoric branches. So this is the conclusion. In the most promising case, by doing this, you wind up with these hard-coded ancestral relationships, and that pulls the ancestral date to a date which is entirely congruent with the step model. Here's another analysis involving a bunch of additional languages and a slightly different date. We did many, many different analyses. And this produces the additional finding or conclusion on the right of this tree, which is a chronology that's consistent with the step model. So that is the conclusion of this work, is that if you use known ancestry-descendant relationships to infer rates of change, then, and you apply that to the entire tree of language of the language family, then it turns out that the step chronology is actually favored by the phylogenetic methods. There are two cases where computational phylogenetics has been consistent with the consensus of linguists. One is the case of Austronesian, which I already mentioned, and one now is the case of Indo-European. And I'd just like to end by highlighting two sets of conclusions or results that I think we can derive from all of this work. For Indo-Europeanists, about Indo-European chronology and diversification, I think there is now an emerging consensus from linguistics, from genetics, and to some extent from archaeology that is favoring the step chronology. Language diversification models therefore need to explain how pastoralists expand, because the step model is a model of pastoralist expansion, not agricultural expansion. And linguists should not be afraid, as we traditionally have been, of computational tools in phylogenetics, even though often we are qualitative workers. More broadly, the Austronesian and the Indo-European phylogenies have very similar rates of change and chronological stuff going on in them, and I think it may be possible to use what we can learn about those two cases, where there's a lot of anchoring in historical and archaeological data, to infer rates, we should be able to use what we learn about rates of change from those cases and variability in rates of change to apply to cases where we don't actually know that much about historical and archaeological facts, like the languages of North America. And thus I think it will be possible to take these results and do something to pursue Jefferson's ideal of understanding the historical relationships in North America and elsewhere in the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for a very illuminating talk. We do have time for questions. In the front here? No time for questions?
In the back.
Oops. Oh, gentlemen, okay. I'm sorry. Gentleman in the back first, and then and then
thanks,
Dr. Hartle.
Mike Shadlin, Columbia. What's the evidence that the rates of change are similar across different phylogenies when you know them?
So that's an interesting question. What we know for sure is that it's a little hard to recover the actual posited rates from phylogenetic tools. What we know from qualitative work on rates of change in Austronesian is that the variability in rates of change is roughly from the slowest to the fastest languages is 1 to 5. And we have the same variability in the Indo-European data set. There have been studies of Bantu and I think it's Bantu and Indo-European, which have found a similar kind of a similar consistency in the overall pattern of posited rates of change. But we have not actually run the numbers and to be able to actually make a concrete argument. But the overall the differences between the estimated difference between the slowest and the fastest languages is the same. And so that is the basis for the hope that there will be the hope that we will be able to have a sort of similar overall statistical pattern of rates across the two families.
Okay, Dr. Hartle.
James Hartle. To what extent can these techniques be applied to look for larger structures than Indo-European? That is, families that include Indo-European, but also other language groups?
You mean, so, if I can paraphrase you, can we find previously unrecognized language families?
Yeah.
That's a good question. These methods, as they are currently used, cannot do that, because you have to, I mean, it depends exactly what you're coding, but if you're coding the way that people normally code in these analyses, you are already stipulating relatedness. So you're coding, you know, in that Polynesian example, you're coding which words are related to each other.
I've got it, thank you.
But you could use other types of characters and then allow the software to try to infer relationships. So you could code, does this language have the following linguistic feature? And those features are independent of relationship. And you could then ask, does the software pick out relationships that, do the algorithms pick out relationships that are previously unknown? And people have tried to do that. It's very controversial because the basic question that arises is, are you picking up genealogical relationships, or are you picking up connections that are due to language contact? And most of those kinds of features that get coded, like, do you have this phonological property, or do you have prepositions as opposed to postpositions? Most of the things that are coded that then can be used for that purpose are things that also spread relatively easily. So it gets very difficult to distinguish linguistic diffusion from linguistic descent.
Thank you.
Sure. We have time for one more question, Dr. Shapiro.
Erwin Shapiro, Cambridge, Mass. I was just curious if any of these techniques would work to go back to the original language.
No.
But a good question nonetheless, and one which, in some sense, it's the ultimate historical linguistic question. Yes.
I would say it goes beyond our pay grade.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew.